in the G20, the core theme under India's presidency, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which comes from this intrinsic belief of one earth, one family, one future, is why UNDP's and the broader UN system's partnership on the G20 becomes really important, especially since digital is changing the context of development across the world.
Hello, and welcome to the third season of the Anahita Speaker Series presented by Carnegie India. The Anahita Speaker Series celebrates stirring stories of empowerment, struggle, success from women professionals in different fields across the globe. Stories we hope are bound to inspire young professionals. I am Anahita Kaur, Research Assistant and Program Coordinator for the Security Studies Program at Carnegie India. And today we're delighted to have with us Keyzom Massally, who is the Head of Digital Programming at the UNDP Chief Digital Office. She's a passionate advisor focusing on inclusive digital growth with a whole of society approach for the achievement of sustainable development goals. Her current work entails unlocking a more equitable world by encouraging, implementing, and scaling digital public goods and digital public infrastructure to tackle global dilemmas. She also steers UNDP's work on inclusive connectivity and digital capacity building. Keyzom, it is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Just to start off the conversation, you are leading UNDP's partnership with the G20 on digital public infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about this and why do you think it's important?
Well, great to be here again. The Indian foreign minister has often said we are on the side of justice, dialogue, and human rights when asked about India's position on a number of issues that are fracturing the world today, especially as India sits as a guest in the UN Security Council this year. And in many ways, this deep-rooted ethos of standing up for what is right without bias and charting new spaces for dialogue and human connections is very much part of India's DNA. And therefore, in the G20, the core theme under India's presidency, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which comes from this intrinsic belief of one earth, one family, one future, is why UNDP's and the broader UN system's partnership on the G20 becomes really important, especially since digital is changing the context of development across the world. Because countries everywhere are building their digital infrastructure, and if it is not built well with the right safeguards, with the right approach towards inclusion, particularly inclusion of women, of the population segments that are often marginalized, we may be in a situation where digital can lead to more divide instead of accelerating the sustainable development goals. So with India's leadership, both in terms of how it has demonstrated population scale impact, but also the ongoing work that India is leading domestically in terms of ensuring that women are indeed participating economically, socially through digital public infrastructure, makes India a global laboratory, in fact, to really support this agenda worldwide, particularly in the low middle income countries. Now, as UNDP, we are not a technology company. We are a development agency. We work across 171 countries worldwide. Our strong programmatic focus, of course, is in the low middle income countries. Therefore, the partnership with India really is around mainstreaming digital public infrastructure in the right ways, where not just technology and its interoperable building blocks are important, but also the governance, the enabling environment around it, and the right safeguards that lead to empowerment of people.
Right. So moving on, when we talk about digital cooperation, what are your thoughts about India's G20 presidency? You mentioned about inclusion and marginalization. How do you think the efforts of the G20 can help India bridge the digital gender gap that we have?
Absolutely. The G20 is really important this year because it comes under India's presidency and this strong commitment India has towards inclusive multilateralism. India's presidency will be followed by the presidency of Brazil and thereafter South Africa, which makes it, for the first time, there's momentum and continuity across a number of years with the Global South's leadership in this very important platform, and therefore the sort of commitment that India has to really accelerate the sustainable development goals, leveraging digital public infrastructure is an emerging theme that India is championing, not just in one working group, for example, the Digital Economy Working Group, but also across all the ministries, whether it's health, whether it's commerce, whether it's financial inclusion. And the Honorable Prime Minister of India has often said that, the public infrastructure that India has developed and the model through which it has engaged with the private sector as well as the community groups to figure out and accelerate last mile inclusion are important lessons that India is willing to share and engage in a constructive dialogue.
Right. So when you talk about SDGs and you talk about digital public infrastructure, what do you think India can do to expand its digital public infrastructure to achieve sustainable development goals?
That's a great question, and this is indeed the uh, core discussion in the G20, but also in our bilateral conversations engaging with the government of India, as well as the broader digital ecosystem that contributed significantly to India's success and continues to work with the government on the last mile inclusion and the safeguards that are necessary for all users of digital public infrastructure. Now, India has, I believe, three opportunities, and these are opportunities that require collective global action for digital cooperation. One is that often there is this very limited understanding that digital public infrastructure is only about technology. And this is something that India has proven through its own experience and learnings that while digital public infrastructure's technology may be in place, the inclusion of last mile, particularly the migrant crisis that we saw at the start of the COVID-19 crisis, require the bridging of the infrastructure with the communities and the people it aims to serve. And therefore, the direction of travel in the G20, as well as for the digital public infrastructure agenda more broadly, needs to include the non-technology layers of governance and community. And this is something that India is really driving within the context of the G20, as well as, of course, it's in its global engagement, including in the UN's Global Digital Compact processes. The second is that, as I mentioned before, countries worldwide, particularly the low middle income countries, are building their digital infrastructure. And there is a financing gap in terms of the planning, the design, the whole of society approach, where the broader set of stakeholders beyond government need to be engaged in the process, and that remains woefully underfunded. And this is an agenda item that, as the United Nations Development Program, we are championing to unlock additional resources from member states. And here, India is championing this in the G20 as well to create that sustainable pooled financing mechanism that can benefit low middle income countries directly. And the third, of course, is that as India offers itself as a lab for lessons learned, for peer exchanges among countries, there's a need to really create those constructive spaces for dialogue, which will facilitate cooperation not just among governments, but also local digital ecosystems, both in terms of sharing technology, lessons learned, blueprint, and so on. And India is championing as part of its third priority, around which the UN stands with it to support it, a networked centers of excellence where, whether it's in Kigali in Rwanda or Nairobi in Kenya, or New Delhi or Washington, D.C., that these connection points can really serve as this collective space for meaningful digital cooperation.
I think that was a very interesting insight that you offered, that DPIs have to go beyond just technology to include more about non-tech aspects as well. From here, I'd like to segue on a little bit of a personal front. Can you tell us a little bit about your early journey and the start of your career at the UN? And according to you, what impact do you think being a refugee had in your professional career?
Um, I consider myself an Indian, and I do have roots in Arunachal Pradesh as well. This is perhaps before borders were drawn. But the reality, of course, is that I grew up as a Tibetan refugee in northern India, and um, uh, that upbringing was instrumental in how in making me a global citizen, because with my cultural influence as well as the culture around me in North India, really sort of developed a very strong understanding of sort of diverse opinions, diverse cultural practices, and that is something that helps me be much more adaptable as I travel around the world on different UN postings from Papua New Guinea to Sierra Leone, and so on. Of course, I'm so grateful for that upbringing because I had an opportunity to also really call India my home, and engage in a number of cultural practices which are some of the holidays that me and my family celebrate, such as Diwali or Eid or Holi, which is one of our favorite holidays. Now, of course, that being a refugee and stateless for many years really kind of shaped my own commitment that as I grow up and chart my professional career forward, that I would like to be in roles that's really around achieving population scale impact, because like me there are a number of refugees around the world, that we see, especially as crises are happening all around the world, including the most recent earthquake, which has led to many internally displaced people in Turkey. So that commitment to service really comes from that early journey and experience of being a refugee.
Right. That's very interesting. You just mentioned that over the course of your career, you've held different UN postings. You've worked at the UN in different capacities. You were a financial sector consultant, then you worked at the UN Capital Development Fund, and now you're at the UNDP. Can you tell us a little bit about how the transition was from these different roles in the UN and how it led you to the UNDP?
Sure. um, the when I graduated from Cornell University, where I did my bachelor's and master's, I was very committed to working at the UN, and I joined the UN Capital Development Fund in New York as my first job after my graduation. But soon after 1 year, I felt that I needed field experience, that I needed to know what we were talking about at the headquarters in terms of, um, you know, uh, in terms of development cooperation, in terms of the issues that required collective actions of member states that make up the United Nations. Um, so with this, I went off to Mumbai and I joined actually a startup in Bombay called Intellicap. And it was a social enterprise, a first of its kind, and it really took me to all corners of India, from Coimbatore to small villages in Jharkhand, where I did, business planning with farmer cooperatives. I even supported the business plan of Muruganandan, who's the entrepreneur around which the movie Padman was made. And I remember really sort of being put in very difficult situations where where you are trying to explain fundamentally what is business planning to these different entrepreneurs that we were supporting, and it prepared me to really kind of understand in very tangible ways what creating impact means, and how to support and amplify the impact that's being created at the grassroots level. And those insights and lessons are what I sort of took with me to the various country offices that I became part of as the United Nations Capital Development Fund advisor on financial inclusion in Papua New Guinea, and then my own sort of kind of secondment from the United Nations to support the Ebola response in West Africa, where the goal, the lessons learned from those are, sort of moving around in these various roles really helped me understand what delivering impact means, and how to work with a diverse range of stakeholders to ultimately not just leave meetings with discussions, but with action items, with next steps, to build consensus so that we may move forward with actions that lead to better supporting affected communities, better supporting governments to make changes in the legal frameworks, in better supporting the innovation ecosystem to build the solutions that women farmers may use, etc. So these ranges of experience, though they may be with different organizations, including different entities within the United Nations, really prepared me to in my role today, which is head of digital programs in our executive office at UNDP, which means that it's a key priority of the United Nations to support inclusive and rights-based digital transformation, and the role really is around how to leverage this tremendous capacity that we have, where we have country office presence across these number of country offices, strong engagement and credibility with government member states in the countries, to really steer the direction of travel of the national development plans and its implementation towards the sustainable development goals.
That's very interesting. Just speaking on what you said earlier, that you've traveled a lot around India, you've also held a lot of UN posts across the world. What, according to you, the field experience that you've gathered, the on-ground experience that you've gathered professionally, do you think that that has had an impact on your personal life as well?
Absolutely. At a personal level, I have a great collection of scarves and clothes and, things that I have collected from women weavers around the world. So I feel quite lucky. Secondly, I remember feeling this quite acutely when I was in Pakistan, working on a startup in Islamabad, where I would often look up in the sky and say, what makes us the same, whether it's India, Pakistan, or Ghana or Colombia in Latin America. What makes us the same? Because it's the same sky that covers us all. And now it may sound a bit cliched, but really, I think these formative experiences of working in very diverse contexts and working with people who were having similar challenges, whether it's India, whether it's other countries, that we must transcend these national borders and differences to apply common approaches, of course, contextualized into different domestic contexts. I think that is probably what is my most significant, I should say, learning from these very diverse experiences.
You also mentioned that your goal has always been on delivering some tangible impact in your life. What, according to you, do you think has been something that you've delivered very impactfully? It could be to an organization, a person, or a region. What has been something that's given you a real sense of purpose?
Um, Something that comes to mind is are two cases. One most recently in Ukraine, when when the war started in Ukraine. UNDP had a multi-year digital transformation project with the Ministry of Digital Transformation in Ukraine, and and a number of humanitarian agencies like World Food Program, like UNICEF, like WHO, everyone was really coming together to undertake cash transfer programs for the affected communities, including internally displaced people or even refugees in the neighboring countries. Um, and the challenge was around how to leverage a common infrastructure so that the humanitarian agencies and the government may have an overview of the population segments that were being served, as well as those that were being left behind, and how to really improve better, through better targeting and service delivery. In that context, I felt, really privileged to be in a position to negotiate between the UN humanitarian agencies and the government to leverage a common infrastructure that was built with the support of the United Nations Development Program. And our discussions, were quite productive. At one point, I remember a humanitarian agency said, well, what government pays to citizens is different from what humanitarian agencies pay. And my rebuttal was that, $100 or 1,000 rupees is the same for a woman recipient who's affected by this war. So therefore, really looking at impact from a people-centered point of view, was critical point of negotiation, really, that I was successfully able to manage in this discussion. The second reflection is during the Ebola crisis, when we had to pay about a growing number of health and first line or frontline response workers during the West Africa crisis. And again, we had the same challenge of being able to correctly identify them and ensure that double payments were not happening to them because different agencies were using different infrastructure, which is also why public infrastructure and using sort of common layers are become very important. And my sort of, of course, we ran that program very successfully. But the biggest sort of lesson that I took away from that experience is a grievance redressal mechanism that we set up where a number of health workers or affected communities could call and get support within 24 hours in terms of, at who is paying them, where is their payment stuck, and any other sort of challenges that that they may be facing. And I would say that grievance redressal mechanism meant that health workers were not going on strikes anymore because no one was hearing them, but rather really, in a process-oriented way, solving their challenges and addressing them together.
That's very interesting, Keyzom. Since you mentioned cash transfer programs, I think this is a good point to bring up that alongside your career at the UNDP, you're also an entrepreneur. You are the co-founder of OpenG2P, which is a voluntary initiative which focuses on expanding DPI. Can you tell us a little bit about how your entrepreneurial journey has been and how it complements your work at the UNDP?
Yeah. So OpenG2P was a technology stack we developed during the Ebola crisis. At that point, it was not called OpenG2P. It was just a bunch of open source code, built modularly to solve some of the items around common registry that could be shared between government and 17 other agencies and NGOs, or this grievance redressal mechanism that I mentioned. And then when COVID-19 started and we saw that, everywhere around the world, governments were facing the same challenge of identifying who to pay, correctly paying them, and then sort of verifying that payment has been made to them. And not just as one agency or one entity, but rather as a shared infrastructure where collectively the development and the humanitarian community could better assess who was being left out or excluded, and also, of course, ensuring fiduciary responsibility through greater transparency, ultimately to the funders of these cash transfer programs. When I saw that challenge again being repeated during the start of the COVID-19 crisis, my head started spinning, and immediately with a group of colleagues and friends, with who had become friends, of course, by then. One of whom actually became my husband later on, who I'm married to, and with whom I have 3 children. We said, "Oh my God, let's do something about it," and that's how we came up with OpenG2P, which is ultimately an end-to-end reusable technology building block that really sort of from a people-centered point of view looks at sort of the start of a journey of enrollment of beneficiaries to ultimately payments, and is built as a public infrastructure such that payment providers or national identity systems can interact with those building blocks. And this became, of course, a great contribution of the government of Sierra Leone as well as UNDP to the broader digital public goods ecosystem. And for me, it was a win-win, not only because I was able to leverage the experience that I had personally had during the Ebola crisis, but also in line with UNDP's mandate to, foster meaningful digital cooperation and bring sort of contributors from many of these countries, low middle income countries, where we have thriving innovation happening as contributors, not just as users of digital public goods. That was really important to me, and it was just great to see this momentum emerge through this OpenG2P initiative.
That's very interesting, Keyzom. We've talked a little bit about your personal life and your professional life, and it's very evident that you have worn many hats in your life. You're an entrepreneur, you are the head of digital programs at the UNDP, and you're also a mother. How do you think you are different in these three capacities? And on a very personal level, do you think that it's actually possible to maintain a healthy work life balance for you?
Indeed. My first priority always are my children. But, I often realize that my work is also a very important priority, especially because, as a based on my own experience growing up, as well as being a Buddhist, for example, the commitment to serve is an important part of how I will use sort of my time in this world. So yes, the short answer is absolutely possible to maintain a healthy work-life balance. And the way I do that, of course, is by ensuring that I have a great support system of colleagues that understand the importance of work-life balance, as well as my own extended family that are ready to jump in when I need additional support. And I, in how busy my work has been over the last year and a half since I joined this role as head of digital programs, I have never felt that I have not been there for my children or participated in their school activities. So I think it's possible to make it work. And making it work obviously requires, dialogue, empathy, and a great support system around you.
Right. Just to wrap up the conversation, I have a rather interesting question to ask you. If it wasn't for what you're doing right now, what do you think would be your alternative choice of career?
um, I'm not sure if it's going to be a. I think if I were to work, this is the best place I could be to make an impact. But in the more recent times, especially as I grow older, I have been thinking about whether am I not better off, meditating somewhere in the mountains, and learning uh, to really sort of discipline my mind and my emotions better. And I think this is particularly important, even no matter what career choice anyone will make, because you know you. I'm a firm believer that you can control what is in your power to control, and therefore the change really that you want to see in your life, in whatever trajectory you choose to go towards, is really in your sort of in your control, and therefore the key to happiness really is sort of you know kind of happiness that comes from within, and that really comes from sort of better understanding yourself and spending a lot of time with yourself. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I would be somewhere meditating for at least a couple years.
Definitely. That sounds very wholesome. Kazon, thank you so much for doing this with us today. This was a very interesting conversation, and I hope everybody has a lot of takeaways from your journey. I hope our audience enjoyed this episode. Please do subscribe to Carnegie India's YouTube channel for more such content. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.